Have you ever looked at your reflection, not just in the mirror, but in the mirror of time? You've made it this far, decades of living, of enduring, of loving, of losing. You've survived storms that many wouldn't even believe. Yet here you are, breathing, standing, or perhaps sitting quietly, wondering, why does life still feel so heavy when I've already put so much behind me? You see, no one really tells us this. That the weight we carry after 70 isn't always in the joints or in the spine. It's in the heart, in the regrets left unresolved, in the expectations still unmet, in the clutter not just in our homes but in our minds. Most of society tells the elderly, add more hobbies, add more people, add more goals. And yes, there is beauty in curiosity and learning, but there comes a time when the real freedom is found not in addition, but in subtraction. What if your joy was never lost? What if it's just been buried beneath layers of things you no longer need, ideas that no longer serve you, relationships that drain you, memories you never asked to carry this long? This chapter, this moment, is a gentle invitation, not to chase happiness, but to let go of what's been blocking it all along. You've spent a lifetime becoming someone. Now, what if the path forward isn't becoming more, but unbecoming everything that's no longer true to you? Pause with me here. Imagine standing at the edge of a still lake. The world is quiet. You're alone, but not lonely. The ripples on the surface are your thoughts, your memories, your fears. And as each one fades, you notice what's been waiting underneath all along: peace, real, lasting peace. And this peace, it's not found in the next gadget or the next piece of advice from someone younger who thinks they know better. It's found in a kind of letting go that feels like coming home. If you're listening to this right now and you're somewhere beyond 60 or 70, maybe even 80, you need to know something the world doesn't say nearly enough. Your life is not winding down, it's waking up. There is still beauty ahead, still mornings to watch the sunlight stream through the window, still evenings to sip tea and watch the moon rise, still conversations that could change everything, still days when you can feel lighter, not because life got easier, but because you finally stopped holding what was never yours to carry. This isn't just another motivational talk. This is a shift in perspective. It's the soft but strong realization that you don't need to chase anything anymore. You don't need to prove. You don't need to impress. You don't even need to wait for others to understand you. You just need to give yourself permission to be free, to let go, to stop apologizing for wanting peace, to start again, but this time with nothing in your hands but presence. And you know what's even more beautiful? It's not too late. It never was. Happiness in the later years isn't something someone else gives you. It's something you allow yourself to receive. Once you've made space by releasing everything that no longer belongs. So the question is no longer, what should I add to my life? The question is, what am I finally ready to let go of? And as we gently begin peeling back those layers, we'll find the very things that have been silently stealing your joy. They've been there hiding in plain sight, but once you see them clearly, you'll never unsee them again. The journey starts now, not with more effort, not with more doing, but with a deeper listening. A listening to what your heart has been whispering for years. I want peace, not someday, but now. And with that stillness, let's begin. There is a quiet danger that comes with age. It doesn't wear a face. It doesn't announce its arrival. It slips in softly like fog creeping across a mountain ridge. It's the belief that there's nothing left to learn. You've lived over 70 years. You've witnessed the rise and fall of ideas, leaders, technology, and generations. You've held newborn babies in your arms. You've watched sunsets with someone who no longer walks beside you. You've survived wars, the ones outside and the ones within. So it's easy, almost seductive to say, I already know enough. I've seen it all. There's nothing new under the sun. But here's the quiet tragedy of that thought. It begins to close the window to your own soul. In the Zen tradition, a monk once approached the master and asked, "What more must I learn before I reach awakening?" The master replied, "Unlearn what you think you already know." You see, in the Buddhist path, true learning doesn't come from stacking knowledge like books on a shelf. It comes from dissolving illusions. It's not about becoming full. It's about becoming empty enough to see clearly. And that process never ends. Look outside your window, see that old tree. It's still stretching towards the sky, still letting its leaves fall, still welcoming the wind and sun without resistance. It doesn't say, "I've grown enough. I'll stop here." No, it lives by continuing to respond to seasons, to change, to impermanence. And so can you. Let me tell you about Marta. She was 83 when her granddaughter left a box of watercolors on her kitchen table. "I don't paint," Marta said, but that night something pulled at her. She dipped a brush into blue, then green, then orange. By the end of the week, she had painted a sunset. By the end of the month, she had painted her childhood memory of hiding in a field of sunflowers during the war. At 84, she had her first art show. At 85, her painting of a single sunflower won a community award titled The Voice of Wisdom. When asked why she started painting so late, she simply smiled and said, "I guess I finally ran out of excuses to say no to life." In Zen, we call it Shashin, the beginner's mind. A mind not cluttered by pride but wide open in wonder. It is said that in the beginner's mind there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind there are few. And here's the twist. The older you grow, the more precious the beginner's mind becomes. Because the world is not done teaching you. Your body may teach you the art of slowing down. Your solitude may teach you the depth of your inner landscape. Your tears may still teach you something about softness. Every single breath is still a question being asked. So what can you still learn? You can learn how to truly listen without interrupting. You can learn how to forgive without needing an apology. You can learn to sit in silence without needing to fill it. You can learn how to love yourself, not in spite of your past, but because of it. You can learn that aging is not a defeat, but a refinement. A burning away of what's false, until only truth remains. Each morning, ask yourself one gentle question. What is life trying to teach me today? Write it down, just one thing. It could be as small as noticing how your tea tastes different, or as big as realizing you still carry the sorrow of a goodbye never spoken. Then bow to that insight, because that moment of realization is a doorway back to wonder. The wisest monks aren't the ones who speak the most. They are the ones who see clearly, love deeply, and hold no pride in their knowing. They are forever learning from the wind, the child, the bird's cry, the flicker of a flame. And so can you. You don't need a classroom. You don't need a teacher with robes and rituals. You only need a humble mind and a heart that still says, "Teach me." There comes a quiet moment in life, especially as we age, when we realize peace is more precious than people. It's not that we stop loving others. It's not that we become selfish or cold. It's that we finally learn to prioritize the quality of our own energy. The Buddha once said, "An insincere and evil friend is more to be feared than a wild beast. A wild beast may wound your body, but an evil friend will wound your mind." As you grow older, you realize that some relationships are like smoke, clouding your clarity, irritating your soul, and suffocating your ability to breathe freely. They take and never give. They criticize and never uplift. They make you doubt yourself instead of inspiring growth. And the hardest part, we often feel guilty for letting them go. But here's a Buddhist truth worth remembering. Compassion does not mean martyrdom. You can be kind and still walk away. You can forgive someone and still choose not to allow their presence in your life. You can love them from afar and still protect your peace. There is no merit in staying connected to pain out of habit. The Eightfold Path teaches right association, not just right speech or right action, because the people you surround yourself with shape your karma, your mind, and your future rebirths. Ask yourself, does this person bring light to your path or cast shadows on your peace? Do they honor your growth or subtly sabotage it? Sometimes, the most compassionate act you can perform is to step away, not with anger, not with revenge, but with silence and a soft bow of gratitude. Thank you for the lesson. I release you now. And something magical happens when you do. You stop seeking validation from those who will never give it. You stop wasting emotional energy trying to fix what doesn't want to be healed. You create space for new connections, for self-love, for stillness. Zen is not about isolating yourself. It's about clearing away the noise so that the truth of your life can speak. And often, that truth whispers this: let go, not because they're bad, but because you're ready to live well. So cut out toxic relationships, not with guilt, but with grace. Because the peace that follows is the gift you've long denied yourself. And in that peace, your spirit finally begins to bloom. There's something deeply liberating about an empty room, a quiet mind, and a heart no longer carrying yesterday's weight. But in the world we live in, clutter creeps in silently. It fills your closets. It overflows in your mind. It hides in the corners of your heart. And soon, your life is not a sanctuary. It's a storage unit of regrets, fears, and unnecessary attachments. The Buddha taught, you only lose what you cling to. This wasn't just about material possessions. It was a deeper message about mental and emotional hoarding. Let's start with the physical. Look around your space. How many items serve no purpose? How many objects hold energy from a past version of yourself? That jacket you never wear, those boxes of just in case, the gifts you kept out of guilt. Every object you keep should either be useful or joyful. If it's neither, it's a chain. Let it go. You're not discarding the object. You're releasing the memory, the guilt, the expectation attached to it. Now the mental clutter. We replay conversations. We relive mistakes. We anticipate problems that may never arrive. The mind, when untrained, is like a crowded market, noisy, messy, restless. But the Zen mind, it is like a still pond, reflective, clear, and calm. To declutter mentally, try this. Each morning, pause before the day begins. Ask, what am I carrying that's not mine? What thoughts do not serve me anymore? And then, like sweeping a floor, let them go. Again and again, because mental hygiene is daily work. And finally, the emotional clutter. This is the most invisible and the most damaging. It's the resentment you've buried for years. It's the shame you've accepted as identity. It's the unmet expectations you still drag behind like a heavy suitcase. Emotional clutter is tricky. It disguises itself as personality. You might say, I'm just an anxious person, or I've always been short-tempered. But often, these are not truths. They are trauma residues we never cleared out. The Buddha offered us a gentle way to heal. Observe without judgment. Let arise, let pass. Allow old feelings to surface. Feel them, honor them, and then release them. This is not denial. This is transformation. When you declutter your life on all levels, physical, mental, emotional, you're not just cleaning. You're creating sacred space. You're making room for joy to visit, for wisdom to arrive, for peace to stay. Imagine a home with fewer things but more light. A mind with fewer thoughts but more clarity. A heart with fewer wounds but more love. That is the life of Zen. And it's available to you not someday but today. Start small. Let go of one thing, one thought, one burden, and feel the space it leaves behind. That space is your freedom. If there is one illusion that casts a long shadow over the human heart, especially in later life, it is the fear of aging. This fear, silent but persistent, often arises in whispers, the lines deepening on the face, the stiffness of the joints, the names and dates that slip the mind, the mirror that no longer reflects the vitality of youth. But the Buddha, in his profound clarity, reminded us that all things that arise must also pass. Aging is not a flaw in the system, it is the system, and resisting it only leads to unnecessary suffering. Let us pause here and ask, what is it we are truly afraid of when we fear aging? Is it the physical decline, the loss of status, the loneliness, or perhaps the deeper, darker realization that time is finite and our life is inching closer to its final chapter? These are valid concerns, but they are not the end of the story. In fact, from the Buddhist lens, they may not even be the real story. In Buddhism, aging is not a punishment, it's a teacher. It strips away illusion, ego, and attachment. It teaches impermanence not through scripture, but through the body itself. Every wrinkle is a sutra. Every gray hair is a bell of mindfulness. Every forgotten word is a koan asking, "Who are you?" beyond the stories you tell yourself. When we fear aging, we fear losing control. But as we have learned in our spiritual practice, the desire to control is the birthplace of suffering. Youth often feels like mastery of the body, of the future, of potential. But this is just a mirage. Aging reveals the truth. Nothing was ever in our control, and that is oddly liberating. In Zen, there's a saying, "Let go or be dragged." Resisting aging is like clinging to a branch while the river of time pulls at your feet. The tighter you hold, the more it hurts. But when you release, truly release, you begin to flow with time rather than against it. You find yourself floating in a river not of decay, but of deepening wisdom. Some people bloom late, like the cherry blossom that doesn't care whether it blossoms early or late, only that it has fulfilled its nature. There are insights, joys, and levels of compassion that can only emerge in the later years of life. Aging is not a door closing, but a new gate opening, one that leads not outward but inward. Take the Buddha himself. He began his path to awakening after seeing the suffering of an old man. That moment, the encounter with aging, became the catalyst for enlightenment. If aging awakened the Buddha, why can it not also awaken you? There is also a great relief that comes with age, though few recognize it. The pressure to prove, to impress, to accumulate, it all begins to fade. What's left is a space of simplicity and clarity if we allow ourselves to enter it. This is the spiritual gift of growing older, no longer needing to be someone else. You can finally just be. But to fully release the fear of aging, you must also release the stories you've inherited from society. The myth that aging is decline, that youth is beauty, that relevance expires at a certain number. These are not truths, they are marketing strategies. Your value is not tied to your productivity or physical appearance. Your value is intrinsic, and it grows deeper the more you live from awareness. So how do we live without fear of aging? Start by befriending impermanence. Don't just understand it, practice it. Watch the leaves fall without mourning the tree. Watch your body shift without labeling it as loss. Watch each day pass with gratitude, not panic. Then root yourself in purpose, not in age. Purpose doesn't have a deadline. You're not too old to change, to contribute, to learn, to teach. The Dalai Lama said, "Our prime purpose in this life is to help others." And you can do that at any stage of life, sometimes even more effectively with the gentle strength that age brings. Finally, cultivate joy, small, present, quiet joy, the kind that doesn't weigh. We live much of our lives waiting for someone to call, waiting for someone to visit, waiting for someone to understand, to love us the way we want to be loved. to appreciate us without asking, to fix our loneliness, our sadness, our emptiness. And the deeper the weight, the deeper the suffering. One of the most liberating teachings in Buddhism is this: expectation is the seed of suffering. It's not what others do or don't do that causes your suffering. It's what you expect them to do. And in old age, this expectation can become a silent prison. We often look to our children, our spouse, or even society to make us feel happy, seen, and valued. But the truth is, happiness is never handed to you from the outside. It is something you cultivate from within. Imagine this: you're in a garden. There are many flowers and you expect the butterflies to come, but they don't. You feel disappointed, maybe even unloved. But if you focus on nourishing your garden, watering the flowers, removing weeds, planting beauty, the butterflies come on their own. Not because you waited for them, but because you became a place of peace and beauty. This is exactly how inner joy works. You must tend to your own heart. Learn what makes you feel alive. It might be a walk under morning light. It might be learning something new or meditating in silence. It might be writing a letter or tending to a small balcony of plants. In Zen, there's a saying: when you are content with yourself, the world cannot disturb you. This doesn't mean we isolate ourselves or avoid love. It means we stop outsourcing our happiness to others. We begin to see every interaction as a gift, not a transaction. Not, I did this for you, so why don't you love me back? But I offered love because I am love. What you do with it is up to you. There's deep freedom in this. An elderly woman in Japan once said, "When I stopped waiting for my children to make me happy, I started cooking for myself again. I started humming again. And they started visiting more, not out of obligation, but because they saw I was shining." So let us ask ourselves, are we holding others responsible for our joy? Are we blaming them for our inner emptiness? Are we unknowingly turning relationships into emotional debts? Letting go of expectation is not giving up, it's waking up. It's choosing peace over frustration, gratitude over resentment, self-love over dependency. And when you live this way, free from the burden of what others owe you, you begin to walk through life with an unshakable smile, a kind of happiness no one can take away, because it was never borrowed, it was grown. That is the quiet power of letting go of expectations. Not to have less, but to feel more. Not to receive more, but to become more. More joyful, more peaceful, more whole. There's a quiet suffering that arises when we compare ourselves to the younger generations. You may see their energy, their flawless skin, their grasp of technology, or their seemingly endless options. And in contrast, you might feel left behind, irrelevant, or even invisible. But this kind of comparison is not only unnecessary, it's deeply unfair to both them and to yourself. Buddhism reminds us that life is a flowing river, not a stagnant pond. Each generation represents a unique stage in the river of time. A droplet at the river's beginning has different speed and scenery than one near the sea, but both are part of the same sacred journey. When the Buddha taught impermanence, he wasn't trying to make us mourn the past. He was teaching us to be fully present with what is, rather than longing for what was. Clinging to youth, whether it's ours or someone else's, only deepens our dissatisfaction. The truth is, the more you compare, the more you suffer. Comparison is a thief. It steals your joy in the now. And here's the paradox: the very people you're comparing yourself to, many of them envy your wisdom, your groundedness, your freedom from the anxieties they still wrestle with. They're chasing validation, chasing time. You, on the other hand, have the gift of perspective, a panoramic view earned through life's trials and awakenings. In the Zen tradition, a wrinkled hand pouring tea is as sacred as a child's first step. Why? Because both moments contain full awareness. What makes life beautiful isn't the age of the person experiencing it, but the depth of their presence. So instead of comparing, cultivate reverence for your own journey. Remember the hardships you've survived, the people you've loved, the lessons you've embodied. These are not signs of decline, they are the markings of a life well lived. Release the illusion that you are somehow less than because you're older. You're not fading, you're deepening. You're not outdated, you're timeless. And when you see yourself that way, the need to compare dissolves like mist before the morning sun. Let others run their race. You are not in competition with the young. You are in communion with life right here, right now. Take a breath. Let go of the measuring stick and feel the peace that comes when you finally stop comparing and start cherishing. At some point in life, and especially as we grow older, we all carry a silent suitcase filled with regrets. Things we should have done, words we should have said, people we lost, decisions we didn't make, time we wasted. It creeps up at night, doesn't it? In the quiet hours, those ghosts of the past whisper, "Why did you do that?" Or "If only you had chosen differently." But Buddhism offers us a liberating truth. The past no longer exists. It's not a place you can return to. It's not something you can fix. It's like a river that has already flowed past the bend, gone, dissolved into the vast ocean of time. Still, the suffering we feel from our past mistakes is real. Why? Because we cling to them. We replay those moments in our mind like broken records. We believe mistakenly that punishing ourselves will somehow make it right. But let me ask you this, with all the gentleness of the Buddha himself. Would you talk to someone you love the way you talk to your past self? Would you berate an old friend who made a mistake years ago, even after they've changed, grown, suffered, and tried their best to move on? The path of wisdom, the Buddhist path, is not about being perfect. It's about awakening from ignorance, step by step. That includes ignorance of your own worth, your capacity for growth, and the truth that you were doing the best you could with the awareness you had at the time. The Buddha never condemned those who made mistakes. In fact, many of his greatest disciples were former thieves, drunkards, or warriors with blood on their hands. What mattered wasn't their past, but their willingness to wake up in the present. So here is your practice. Forgive yourself. Not as a favor, not as a shortcut, but as an act of deep spiritual maturity. You do not erase the past by reliving it, you redeem it by letting go. You may have hurt others. Then seek forgiveness if you can, and accept that sometimes people won't give it. That's their journey, not yours. What you can do is forgive yourself, so you don't carry the poison of shame into your final years. Forgiveness is not weakness. It's not denial. It's choosing to lay down the whip, to stop bleeding from old wounds, to say to your past self, "You tried, you failed, and now I release you." You are not who you were at 30, 40, or even yesterday. You are who you choose to be now, in this breath, in this moment. That's where liberation lives, not in the shadows of regret, but in the light of present compassion. So look gently at your past self. Smile, even through tears. And whisper, "I forgive you." Because you deserve peace, not punishment. And the moment you forgive yourself, you'll feel it, a great weight lift, like a bird finally let out of its cage. There's a whisper that creeps into many hearts after 70. It's too late. Too late to learn a new skill. Too late to find love again. Too late to leave a legacy. Too late to start over. That whisper is a thief. It steals your hope. It dims your vision. It chains you to a past that no longer serves you. But the Buddha taught that each moment arises fresh, like a lotus blooming on the surface of muddy water. The question is not whether you've lived enough years, but whether you're willing to live this moment fully. From the moment we're born, society writes an imaginary timeline on our lives. By 20, you must choose your career. By 30, you must marry. By 40, You must have it all figured out. And when we see those markers go by, especially in our later years, we feel behind, outdated, finished. But these are social constructs, not truths written by nature. The river doesn't say, just up to this rock, then the current stops. It flows on endlessly, so can your life. In a small Thai village, I once met Somchai, a retired fisherman of 78 years. He had spent his life casting nets in the dawn mist. Then one day, he was gifted a simple calligraphy brush by a traveling monk. At first, Somchai laughed. "Me, a painter," he said, but something in his heart stirred. He picked up the brush. His first strokes were shaky, black ink smudged across the paper, but he kept going, each line more confident than the last. By 80, Somchai's delicate poems and calligraphy adorned the temple walls. Pilgrims would pay respects to his art, calling it the heart of a fisherman, flowing freely. He often said, "I wasted 70 years thinking it was too late. Then I realized, art doesn't care about your age. It only asks for your willingness to show up. Age is simply the count of years you've danced around the sun. It does not measure your capacity to dream, to create, to love. The mind that believes I'm too late builds walls. The mind that whispers, I can still try, builds doors." Buddha's teaching on impermanence, Anicca, reminds us that everything changes, including what you think is possible. What looked impossible yesterday can unfold today if you release the lie that your time has passed. Consider this image: a gardener planting seeds in autumn. It feels strange. Shouldn't the growing season be over? But those seeds rest through winter, then burst into life in spring. Your later years can be the richest soil for new seeds, a new hobby that feeds your soul, a volunteer project that warms your heart, a simple habit of daily gratitude that shifts your entire perspective. You don't need to catch up. You only need to begin. 1. Write a letter to your future self. Describe one thing you wish you'd begun today. Seal it. Open it in 6 months. 2. Adopt the beginner's mind. Approach each new activity, painting, walking, meditation, gardening, as though you're doing it for the very first time. 3. Celebrate small wins. Every brushstroke, every planted seed, every written word, acknowledge it. These small joys fuel the courage to continue. 4. Share your journey. Teach others what you learn. When you inspire even one soul, you prove to your own heart that it was never too late. The Dharma doesn't say, finish your practice by 70. It says, practice every moment. Your story isn't closing, it's unfurling. Your spirit isn't done, it's awakening. Your purpose isn't gone, it's simply waiting for you to acknowledge it today. So let go of that lie that it's too late. Take a slow, deep breath. Feel the aliveness pulsing through your veins. Know this: as long as you draw breath, you can begin anew. And when you finally embrace this truth, you'll notice a gentle blossoming inside, like a lotus unfolding at dawn. Your time, dear friend, is now. There's a quiet myth that echoes through the corridors of old age, a whisper that says, you've done what you can. Now it's time to slow down, to fade out. But this is not a truth. This is not your truth. In Buddhist philosophy, there is no static self. You are not a fixed identity etched into stone. You are a flowing river, constantly evolving, constantly becoming. Even now, especially now in the later chapters of life, you are not finished. You are simply entering a deeper stage of your becoming. You see, old age is not a final act. It is the ripening of all that you have lived, the distillation of your wisdom, your insight, your heart. The world doesn't need a younger version of you. It needs this version of you, the one with stories carved into your hands, with silence that speaks louder than words, with eyes that have seen enough to finally understand. Think of the lotus flower. It blooms most beautifully not when it first breaks the surface, but when it has fully opened in the sunlight. exposing every petal, every mark, every moment of growth. You too are opening now, not fading, not ending, but unfolding into your truest form. What you release in this stage, fear, comparison, regret, is not loss but liberation. And what remains is your essence, finally unobstructed. You become a presence that others feel before you speak, a quiet guide, a teacher not through words but through how you walk, how you smile, how you let go. This isn't the time to hold back. This is the time to let your light soften and spread. You are not done. You are becoming. And your becoming matters, not because of what the world sees, but because of how you now see the world. If this resonated with your soul, if something in these words touched the stillness within you, then know this: you are not alone on this journey. At Zen Buddhism Wisdom, we create these gentle reminders, not to preach but to walk beside you. If you'd like to keep walking with us, subscribe. Let your days be nourished with peace, presence, and purpose. And if you feel someone else might need this message today, pass it on. Sometimes, a single sentence can change the entire course of a soul's journey. Until next time, breathe deeply, live softly, and remember, you are still becoming.